Lucas stood frozen before the towering gates of the abandoned candy factory, the cold wind biting at his skin like icy fingers. The building loomed in the darkness, its once colorful walls now decayed and blackened by time. The legend of the cursed factory echoed in his mind. How it had been closed down after a deadly outbreak of food poisoning, how workers had vanished without a trace. And yet, here he was, drawn to this place like a moth to a flame. His heart pounded as he hesitated, but something deeper, a pull he couldn't explain, urged him forward. As the gate creaked open with a sound that sent shivers down his spine, the scent hit him. It was sickly sweet, like burnt sugar mixed with something foul, something rotten. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the factory itself exhaled its long-held secrets into the night. Lucas took a cautious step inside, the crunch of gravel beneath his feet louder than it should have been. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole, and for a moment, he felt utterly alone. But then he heard it, a faint whirring, like machinery stirring from a long slumber deep within the bowels of the factory. His breath caught in his throat. The machines had been silent for decades, abandoned along with the building. But now, they hummed softly, almost as if they were waking up just for him. Lucas glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but the shadows played tricks on his eyes. The factory was alive with silence and subtle movements, and every creak of metal or gust of wind felt like a whisper aimed at him. His skin prickled as the sensation of being watched grew stronger, as though unseen eyes followed his every move. With hesitant steps, Lucas ventured deeper into the factory. The air grew colder the further he went, and the once muted scent of burnt sugar became overpowering, making his stomach churn. Old candy-making machines stood like silent sentinels, covered in dust and cobwebs, their gears rusted and motionless. Yet somehow, they seemed to pulse with a hidden life. His footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space, each sound reverberating back at him, as if mocking his intrusion. He told himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, movement. A fleeting shadow darted past, disappearing into one of the darkened corridors. Lucas stopped, his breath hitching in his throat. He strained to listen, but there was only the deafening silence that followed. His mind raced. Was it just a trick of the light? Or had someone been watching him from the start? The oppressive atmosphere of the factory seemed to close in on him, the weight of its dark history pressing down on his chest. As he moved toward the corridor, the low hum of machinery grew louder, though none of the machines in sight were moving. The sense of wrongness intensified, and the walls seemed to close in, as though the factory itself was shifting, reshaping, trying to trap him within. Lucas's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, only to find the screen flickering with static. No signal. Of course. The factory was swallowing him whole, cutting him off from the outside world. Panic surged in his chest, but something inside him, perhaps a twisted sense of curiosity, pushed him forward, deeper into the heart of the darkness. The shadow reappeared, flickering at the edge of his vision. This time, it lingered, just long enough for him to catch a glimpse, an indistinct shape, too fast, too fluid to be human. His pulse quickened, and the air felt thicker, harder to breathe. The walls around him seemed to hum, the factory vibrating with some unseen energy, alive with the echoes of the past. His every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run, but his legs betrayed him, carrying him further into the abyss. Suddenly, the faint sound of laughter echoed down the corridor, childlike yet distorted, as if it were being played on a broken record. Lucas froze. The sound filled the air, bouncing off the walls, surrounding him. He turned in every direction, but there was no source. Just the empty, decaying machinery and the creeping darkness. His heart pounded in his ears as the laughter grew louder, more twisted, more malicious. It was mocking him, drawing him deeper into the factory's grasp. And then the lights flickered, just once. But in that brief moment he saw them. Figures, standing among the machines. Not people. Shadows, warped and wrong, their faces twisted into expressions of torment. They watched him with hollow eyes, their mouths agape in silent screams. When the lights flickered off again, the figures were gone, but the feeling of being watched had become unbearable. Lucas staggered backward, the urge to flee overwhelming him. But before he could move, a voice whispered in his ear, so close he could feel the cold breath against his skin. "You shouldn't have come here." Lucas's footsteps echoed in the hollow corridor, each step reverberating off the rusted metal walls like a distant drumbeat. As he ventured deeper into the factory, a strange sense of familiarity began to creep over him, unsettling in its intensity. It wasn't just the eeriness of the decaying machinery or the oppressive weight of the darkness that surrounded him. There was something else, something buried deep within his mind, clawing its way to the surface. His heart raced, not just from fear, but from the inexplicable pull this place had on him. It was as though the factory had latched onto some forgotten part of his soul, refusing to let him leave. The further he went, the more distorted his memories became, blurring the line between the present and some distant, half-remembered past. His hand absent-mindedly brushed against a cold, metal railing, and as his fingers made contact, a sudden flash of an image struck him. A child's hand, smaller, fragile, gripping that same railing. Lucas blinked, shaking his head, but the image lingered, like a shadow at the edge of his mind. He knew he had never been to this factory before, yet the feeling of déjà vu was undeniable. It was as though the factory was whispering to him, stirring old memories that should have remained forgotten. Suddenly, in the dim light, something caught his eye. An object tucked away in the corner, half hidden beneath a pile of debris. Curious and unsettled, Lucas approached, his heart pounding in his chest as he crouched down to get a closer look. It was a small, wooden toy car, worn and battered with age. The sight of it sent a jolt through his body, a cold shiver running down his spine. He knew that toy. He had owned one exactly like it when he was a child. He reached out to touch it, and as his fingers grazed the wood, a flood of memories came crashing down on him. In his mind's eye, he saw himself as a boy, running through a field, clutching the same toy car in his hand. But the memory twisted, darkened. The field morphed into something else. Broken tiles beneath his feet, towering walls of metal looming over him, the sound of machines whirring in the distance. He was in a factory. He had been here before. But why? And how had he forgotten? As Lucas struggled to make sense of the memory, a sharp pain shot through his wrist. He winced and looked down, only to see the faint outline of an old scar, one he had never been able to explain. But now, under the flickering light of the factory, it pulsed with a dull ache, like an old wound being reopened. The more he stared at it, the clearer the memory became. He had gotten this scar here, in this very factory. He could almost hear the faint hum of the machines, the clanking of metal, and the scream. A child's scream, piercing and desperate, echoed in his mind, sending chills down his spine. It was his own voice, crying out in terror. He staggered backward, gripping his head as the fragments of memory continued to assault him. He saw flashes of faces, workers, machines spinning out of control, a thick, sickly sweet smell filling the air, and then darkness. His heart raced as the realization hit him with full force. Something terrible had happened here, and he had been part of it. But the memory wasn't complete. Something was missing, something crucial, and the factory seemed to know it. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer, more sinister. His breath quickened as the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. It wasn't just the factory itself that held these secrets. It was watching him, studying him, waiting for him to uncover the truth it had long kept hidden. The toy car, still clutched in his trembling hand, felt heavier now, as though it was imbued with some dark energy from the past. He dropped it, stepping back, but the scar on his wrist burned like fire. As he looked up, the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before him, twisting in ways that defied logic, leading him further into the heart of the factory. It was drawing him in, pulling him towards something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. In the distance, Lucas heard the faint sound of a lullaby. It was haunting, eerie, the notes warbling as though they were being sung by someone, or something, deep within the walls. The melody was familiar, achingly so, and Lucas's stomach churned as he realized why. It was the same lullaby his mother had sung to him when he was a child, the one that had comforted him on nights when the nightmares came. But hearing it here, in this cursed place, turned the once soothing tune into something menacing. His legs felt like lead as he took a step toward the source of the music, drawn forward by a force he couldn't resist. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to leave this place and never look back. But he couldn't. Something inside him needed to know, needed to remember. As he walked deeper into the factory, the memories became sharper, clearer. He had been here, with his family. There had been laughter, joy, and then the accident. He remembered now. The day the factory had closed, the day everything had changed. Suddenly, the lullaby stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air grew colder, and the smell of burnt sugar returned with a vengeance, stronger and more nauseating than before. Lucas felt his pulse quicken as he turned a corner and saw it. A door, slightly ajar, with faint light spilling through the crack. He didn't want to open it, didn't want to face what lay beyond, but he knew he had no choice. His past was waiting for him on the other side, and with it, the truth that had been buried deep within the factory's walls for years. With a trembling hand, Lucas pushed the door open, stepping into the room. And there, in the center of the room, was something he had buried long ago, a memory he had tried to forget, now staring him in the face, demanding to be remembered. Lucas stood in the center of the dimly lit room, his breath shallow, his pulse racing. The door creaked shut behind him, sealing him inside the space that felt more like a tomb than anything else. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, and in the center of the room, illuminated by a weak, flickering light, stood an old machine, ancient, rusted, and forgotten by time. Yet, it hummed with an unnatural energy, as if it were alive, waiting for something. And then, from the shadows, a voice slithered into his mind. "You've come this far, but now you must choose." The voice was neither human nor entirely otherworldly. It was cold, emotionless, but filled with a strange authority, as though it commanded the very essence of the factory. Lucas's skin crawled, and he instinctively backed away, but there was no escape. The room seemed to warp, twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. His head pounded, his vision blurred, and the voice spoke again, this time closer, as if it were whispering directly into his ear. "You hold the key to end this, or to be consumed by it." Before Lucas, two apparitions flickered into existence, standing silently on either side of the machine. The first was a shadowy figure, featureless, but familiar. It took him a moment to realize it was himself, or at least a twisted reflection of him, hollow-eyed and expressionless, its presence radiating despair and darkness. The second figure was a small child, clutching a teddy bear, his sister Emma. His heart clenched painfully as her innocent face stared up at him, eyes wide with terror. "You can save her, Lucas. You can undo what was done." The voice teased him, each word dripping with malice. But there was a catch. Lucas knew it instinctively. Nothing in this cursed place came without a price. The figure of his sister flickered, her form wavering like a distant mirage. The choice was impossibly cruel. Sacrifice a part of himself, something precious, to save her. But what? His memories, his very soul. The factory wasn't clear, but Lucas could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him, as if the walls themselves were tightening around him, forcing him to decide. The voice grew sharper, more insistent. "Give me the memory you cherish most, the one that defines who you are. Or let her suffer for eternity in this place, forgotten and alone." The choice echoed through Lucas's mind, shaking him to his core. His mind raced. What was the memory? He thought back, grasping at fleeting images, and then it hit him. The memory of his mother. The one thing that had kept him grounded, even in the worst times of his life. The lullaby she used to sing, her voice a soft whisper in the dark, comforting him on stormy nights. If he gave that up, he would lose her forever. He would lose the one thing that had made him feel safe, loved, and whole. But if he didn't, he looked at Emma, her small, fragile form trembling in the dark. His heart ached as he remembered the promise he had made to protect her, even though he had failed her all those years ago. Guilt twisted like a knife in his chest. Could he live with himself if he condemned her to whatever terrible fate awaited her here? Could he let her be swallowed by the same darkness that now threatened to consume him? Lucas felt the weight of his decision crushing down on him. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the temperature dropping to an unbearable chill. His hands trembled as he stared at the machine, its gears creaking, waiting for him to make his move. The shadows around him deepened, and the voice grew louder, more impatient. Choose, Lucas. Time is slipping away. Save her, or save yourself. The darkness is hungry. The machine's gears started to turn on their own, slowly grinding into motion as if sensing Lucas's hesitation. He could almost feel its hunger, the ancient thing feeding on his fear, his indecision. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the world around him blurred. The figure of his sister flickered again, her face twisting into a look of desperation. Please, Lucas, don't leave me. Her voice was soft, fragile, like a breeze that could be snatched away at any moment. Lucas clenched his fists, his mind racing. He could save her, but at what cost? The memory of his mother was all he had left of her. To lose, that was to lose a piece of himself forever. But to walk away meant condemning his sister to an eternity of torment, trapped in this place, her soul tethered to the cursed factory. The voice hissed in his ear. There is no time. Choose now. The darkness does not wait. In that moment, Lucas felt the crushing weight of inevitability. The factory had lured him here for this very reason, to force him into an impossible decision. The room seemed to spin around him, the walls groaning, the sound of machinery growing louder, more frantic. He looked down at his sister one last time, her eyes pleading, her small hands clutching the teddy bear he had given her so long ago. And then, with a deep breath, Lucas made his choice. He stepped toward the machine, hard hammering in his chest, and placed his hand on the cold metal. The memory of his mother flickered in his mind like a candle in the wind, fragile and fleeting. The lullaby she used to sing echoed softly, a fading note that tore at his soul. Tears welled in his eyes as the realization hit him. He would never remember her voice again, never feel that warmth, that safety. The memory would be gone, erased as if it had never existed. The machine whirred to life, and with a sharp, searing pain that shot through his entire body, Lucas felt the memory being ripped from him. The ache in his heart was immediate, a hollow emptiness that filled the space where his mother's love had once been. The darkness around him seemed to roar in triumph, and the factory trembled as if fed by his sacrifice. But as the memory faded into oblivion, the figure of his sister remained. She blinked, her eyes wide with confusion, but she was there, whole alive. Lucas stumbled back, his vision blurred, the weight of his choice crushing him from the inside out. He had saved her, but at what cost? The room began to collapse around him, the shadows retreating, but the hollow emptiness in his chest remained. Lucas had made the impossible choice, but as the factory crumbled into dust, one thought echoed in his mind. Was it worth it? Lucas staggered away from the machine, the weight of his choice bearing down on him like an iron chain. The factory felt different now, alive with a new, sinister energy that pulsed through the air. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The oppressive silence that had once filled the building was gone, replaced by a low, humming murmur, as if the very walls of the factory were whispering secrets to each other. Lucas's pulse quickened as the sensation of being watched returned, stronger than ever before. But this time, it wasn't just a feeling, it was real. Something was here with him. The shadows seemed to move on their own, sliding along the walls and floor, writhing like living things. They stretched and contracted, bending the light in ways that defied logic, as if they had a mind of their own. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as he saw them gather in the corners of the room, thickening into dark masses that swayed and pulsed in unison. The whispers grew louder, clearer, filling his mind with fragmented, unintelligible words. It was as if the factory itself was speaking to him, but in a language he couldn't understand, a language made of fear and madness. His footsteps echoed hollowly as he moved deeper into the factory, but the whispers followed him, growing more insistent with every step. Lucas. The voice was faint at first, like a distant echo carried on the wind, but it grew stronger, closer. Lucas. It was calling him, drawing him into the shadows, where the darkness seemed to twist and writhe, almost alive. He spun around, trying to locate the source, but the factory was a maze of corridors and abandoned machinery, every corner cloaked in deep, unnatural shadow. The machines, long dead and rusted, began to groan and creak, as if something was moving inside them, straining against the metal. The sound of grinding gears and hissing steam filled the air, but none of the machines were functioning. Lucas could feel the factory waking up around him, the old, forgotten equipment stirring to life in ways it shouldn't. His heart pounded as he realized that it wasn't just the machines. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, as if the entire structure was alive, a creature made of brick and metal, watching him with 1,000 unseen eyes. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of burnt sugar and something far more foul, like decay, rotting flesh mixed with the sickly sweetness. It clawed at Lucas's throat, making him gag. He stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the wall to steady himself, but when his fingers touched the surface, it felt wrong, soft, damp, as though the wall itself had begun to rot. He yanked his hand away, and in the dim light, he saw the imprint of his fingers left behind, sinking slightly into the wall like it was flesh, not stone. Panic gripped him, and the whispers intensified. This time they were clearer, more distinct, but still just beyond comprehension. The shadows began to shift again, flowing like black water along the floor and walls, coalescing into shapes, vague, human-like forms that twisted and writhed, never staying still long enough for Lucas to make out any clear details. But they were watching him. He could feel their eyes, cold and hollow, staring at him from within the darkness. Lucas. The voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't coming from the shadows. It was inside his head, soft but insistent, like the caress of a cold breeze against his mind. He spun around, desperate to find the source, but the shadows moved with him, sliding along the floor, growing closer. One of the figures stepped forward, its form shifting and changing with every moment. It reached out, a long, twisted hand extending toward him, and though it had no face, Lucas could feel it smiling, a dark, malevolent grin that sent chills down his spine. "You don't belong here." The voice whispered, a cruel, mocking tone that echoed through the air. Lucas backed away, his heart racing. The shadows seemed to follow him, closing in from every direction, their shapes shifting into grotesque, distorted figures. The air grew colder, and the walls groaned, the whispers growing louder and more aggressive. He could feel the factory's hunger, a deep, insatiable void that seemed to crave his presence. His mind reeled as the voice continued, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. "You can't escape. You are part of this now." The figure in front of him melted into the shadows, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The factory wasn't just a building. It was alive, sentient, and it was playing with him. Every shadow, every whisper, was part of its twisted game, designed to push him to the brink of madness. Suddenly, the lights above flickered violently, plunging the room into near-total darkness. For a heartbeat, Lucas was blind, surrounded by nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing and the relentless whispers. When the lights sputtered back to life, the shadows were closer, pressing in on him from all sides. The walls seemed to close in, warping and bending, and Lucas felt as though the factory was trying to swallow him whole. A cold breath touched the back of his neck, and Lucas spun around, his heart nearly stopping as he saw the figure standing inches away from him. It was no longer just a shadow. It was something more solid, more real. Its face was pale, its eyes black voids that seemed to swallow the light. Its mouth opened in a wide, unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice like nails scraping against glass. Lucas's legs felt like lead as he stumbled backward, but the figure followed, gliding silently over the floor. The shadows moved with it, twisting and swirling around its form. The whispers grew deafening, filling Lucas's mind with a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words overlapping and intertwining until they were indistinguishable from one another. His vision blurred, the room spinning, and he felt his grip on reality slipping. The figure loomed closer, its grin widening impossibly, and Lucas realized with a cold, sinking dread that it wasn't just a creature of the factory. It was the factory, the entity that had been watching him, tormenting him, manipulating him from the moment he stepped inside. The walls groaned again, and the floor beneath him shifted, tilting as if the entire building was collapsing inward. "You belong to us now," the voice whispered one last time, and Lucas felt the cold tendrils of shadow wrapping around his legs, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The factory was alive, and it had chosen him as its next victim. Lucas's pulse was pounding in his ears, louder than the whispers now swirling around him. His vision blurred, and the oppressive darkness of the factory seemed to press in closer with every breath. The shadows moved with intent, twisting and curling around his feet, tugging at his thoughts, his mind, as if they could pull him into the abyss if he allowed himself to succumb. Every step he took seemed to take more effort, like wading through thick, invisible sludge. And in the distance, just out of sight, something was watching, waiting. The terror was beginning to worm its way into Lucas's mind, distorting his perception of everything around him. The air felt heavier, like it was suffocating him. The walls warped, the ceiling lowered, and he felt as though the factory itself was shrinking, compressing around him like a vice. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps. The cold metal machinery, the scent of burnt sugar still lingering like a ghost in the air, the flickering, dying light. It was all closing in. His head swam with dizziness, and he could no longer tell if the room was spinning or if it was his own mind unraveling. And then, the hallucinations began. At first, they were subtle. Lucas glanced to his left and saw movement. Just a flash, like a figure darting through the shadows, gone before he could fully register it. His heart jumped in his chest, but when he looked again, there was nothing. He blinked, shook his head. His senses were betraying him, playing tricks. Or were they? He could no longer tell what was real and what was the factory's twisted design. The very air around him felt alive, shifting, warping, pulling at the edges of his sanity. Then the voices returned, no longer whispers, but loud, insistent, drilling into his skull like nails. He heard laughter, twisted and broken, like the mocking giggles of children distorted through a broken record. He heard his own name, over and over, spoken in a chorus of voices, some familiar, others alien. It was as if the factory knew his deepest fears, and now it was toying with him, pushing him to the brink. His fear became a living thing, gnawing at him, twisting his thoughts, and feeding the malevolent presence that lurked in the shadows. "Lucas, remember." The voice slithered into his mind, a haunting echo that dragged up memories he had long buried. His mother's lullaby. The day he lost his sister in the factory. The guilt, the fear. It all flooded back with brutal clarity, hitting him like a tidal wave. The walls rippled, shifting, and suddenly, the corridor he had been walking through wasn't the factory anymore. It was the hallway of his childhood home. The air was thick with the scent of warm cookies, and the sound of a piano playing softly drifted in from a room down the hall. He knew this place. It was a memory, a happy one. But something was wrong. The walls of the hallway stretched and bent, the familiar, comforting sound of the piano distorting into something off-key, broken. The laughter of children echoed faintly, but it wasn't the light-hearted sound he remembered. It was cruel, mocking, as though the shadows themselves were ridiculing him. He moved toward the door at the end of the hall, his feet heavy, his breath shallow. His hands trembled as he reached for the knob. He knew what he would find on the other side, but he couldn't stop himself. The factory was inside his mind now, twisting his memories, turning them into nightmares. The door creaked open, and there she was, his sister, Emma, sitting on the floor of her old room, playing with a doll. But when she turned to look at him, her eyes were wrong, empty, hollow, black as the void. Her mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, her skin pale and waxy. The doll she held twitched, its head snapping around with a crack, staring at him with the same dead eyes. "You left me here, Lucas," she whispered, her voice both hers and not hers. "You didn't save me." Lucas stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway around him twisted and writhed, the walls darkening, melting into the familiar cold steel of the factory once again. The illusion shattered, but the terror it left behind lingered. His sister's voice echoed in his ears, her accusing eyes still burned into his mind. The guilt gnawed at him, twisted by the factory's malevolent influence. The shadows around him pulsed, feeding off his fear, growing larger, darker. They whispered to him, offering false comforts, tantalizing promises. "Give in, Lucas. You can end the pain. You can be free." The words slithered into his thoughts, wrapping around his mind like a noose. His fear was consuming him, distorting his reality. He could barely tell what was real anymore. The factory, the shadows, his own memories. It was all blending together into one endless nightmare. Lucas felt himself slipping. His hands trembled as he pressed them to his temples, trying to block out the voices, trying to ground himself. But the hallucinations wouldn't stop. The factory wanted him to lose control, wanted him to drown in his terror. The shadows around him writhed, their shapes contorting into grotesque figures, their mouths stretching wide in silent screams. They reached for him, their fingers long and thin, claw-like, as though they wanted to drag him into the darkness. And then he saw her again, his sister, Emma, standing at the far end of the room, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "You can save me, Lucas," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of whispers and grinding machinery. "You can end this. Just give in." Lucas staggered backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The factory was inside his head, twisting everything, turning his worst fears into reality. The hallucinations were relentless, warping his perception of the world around him. The shadows, the voices, his sister. It was all too much. He could feel himself breaking, his sanity slipping through his fingers like sand. The factory wanted him to give in to the fear, to let it consume him entirely. But somewhere, deep inside, Lucas knew that if he gave in, if he let the terror take him, there would be no escape. He would be lost, just like the others who had come before him. The factory fed on fear, on guilt, on despair, and it was hungry. With every ounce of strength he had left, Lucas forced himself to move, to fight against the suffocating darkness. His vision blurred, his mind screamed at him to stop, to surrender, but he kept going. The shadows reached for him, the voices grew louder, but he pushed forward, step by agonizing step, refusing to let the terror claim him. But as he walked deeper into the factory's twisted heart, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real nightmare had only just begun. Lucas could barely see through the oppressive darkness that seemed to thicken with every step he took. His mind was fraying at the edges, the factory's relentless assault on his sanity pushing him to the brink. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, filled with the choking scent of burnt sugar and rot, like something had been decaying for centuries beneath the cold metal floor. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct now, as though the factory itself was speaking directly into his mind. Every wall, every rusted machine, seemed alive with an unnatural energy, as if watching him, waiting for him to break. But was the figure standing in the center of a room that stopped Lucas in his tracks. At first, it seemed like another hallucination, another twisted image conjured by his own terror. But this figure was different, taller, more defined, and disturbingly real. Its body was composed of the same shadows that had been tormenting him from the start, but its form was solid now, a monstrous silhouette that radiated a malevolent presence. The shadows clung to it like a cloak, writhing and twisting as though alive, but its face was a nightmare made flesh. Hollow black eyes stared back at him, empty and void of any humanity. Its mouth, a jagged line, stretched into a grotesque grin that didn't seem possible on any living thing. Lucas's blood turned to ice. This was it. This was the entity that had been haunting the factory, feeding on his fear, his guilt, his memories. The whispers that had once been distant murmurs now crescendoed into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words a chaotic tangle of threats, accusations, and mocking laughter. They surrounded him, suffocating him, filling his mind with darkness. "You came here, Lucas," the figure spoke, but the voice didn't come from its mouth. It echoed inside his head, each word sharp, cutting through the air like glass. "You've always belonged here." Lucas's legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place as the entity's words seeped into his bones. The figure stepped closer, each movement fluid and unnatural, like it wasn't bound by the same laws of reality. The shadows around it stretched and twisted, snaking along the floor toward Lucas, wrapping around his ankles like cold, invisible chains. He couldn't move. He could barely breathe. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him with a sickening force. This thing wasn't just an entity. It was the factory itself, the embodiment of everything twisted and dark about the place. It had been waiting for him, watching, pulling him deeper into its web. "Do you remember now?" the voice hissed, and suddenly, Lucas was drowning in memories. He was back in the factory as a child. The day it happened, he saw the machines roaring to life, the candy churning in the vats, the workers screaming, the chaos erupting all around him. And in the center of it all, he saw himself, small, frightened, and completely out of control. The machines had malfunctioned, but it wasn't an accident. He had been there, playing with the controls, pushing buttons he didn't understand. The gears ground together, the candy became poisoned, and people died. It was his fault. He had caused the accident. The guilt hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him, suffocating him. "You were always part of this place," the entity continued, stepping closer, its hollow eyes locked on Lucas. Asterisk, "You brought this upon them, and now you return to face the truth." Asterisk, the shadows tightened around Lucas's body, pulling him to the floor. His mind screamed in protest, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in the web of his own guilt, a puppet in the factory's twisted game. The figure leaned in closer, its grin widening impossibly, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "You can never leave." The words were final, a death sentence. But then, in the deepest recesses of his mind, Lucas heard something else. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A lullaby, his mother's voice. The memory he thought he had sacrificed, lost forever. It was faint, but it was there, a small light in the overwhelming darkness. He clung to it, desperate. The memory wasn't gone, not completely. It was buried, hidden beneath the layers of fear and guilt the factory had piled on him. Lucas focused on the lullaby, letting it wash over him, pushing the fear back, just for a moment. And in that moment, something shifted. The shadows around him faltered, loosening their grip just enough for him to move. He scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, his vision still blurry from the onslaught of memories. The entity recoiled, just slightly, as though the lullaby had disrupted its hold on him. "You're wrong," Lucas whispered, his voice hoarse but filled with a newfound strength. "I don't belong here. The entity's grin faltered, and the shadows writhed more violently, as though they were reacting to his defiance. "You cannot escape," it hissed, the voices around him rising in anger, the walls of the factory groaning and creaking as the malevolent energy intensified. But Lucas took a step forward, then another. The lullaby grew louder in his mind, pushing back the fear, the guilt, the darkness. He could feel the factory's grip weakening, the entity's control slipping. "I made a mistake," Lucas said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But I won't let it control me anymore." The entity screeched, a sound like metal grinding against metal, and the factory trembled. The shadows lashed out at him, but Lucas kept moving forward, toward the figure, toward the heart of the darkness. The air around him grew colder, the scent of rot and decay intensifying, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The entity loomed over him, its form distorting, becoming more monstrous, more twisted. But Lucas didn't back down. With one final, desperate step, Lucas reached into the shadows, his hand plunging into the cold darkness surrounding the entity. The whispers screamed in his mind, but he pushed through, grasping at something deep within the void. And then he felt it, a pulse, weak but still there. The heart of the factory, the source of the entity's power. Lucas clenched his fist, his entire body trembling with the effort, and pulled. The shadows screamed, the factory shook, and for a moment, everything was chaos. The entity's hollow eyes widened in shock, its grin faltering, its form unraveling as Lucas ripped the source of its power from the shadows. The factory began to collapse around him, the walls crumbling, the machinery screeching as it was torn apart. The shadows thrashed wildly, but they were losing their grip, their hold on Lucas slipping away. The entity screeched one final time, its form disintegrating into nothingness. And then, silence. Lucas stood there, his breath heavy, his body shaking, as the factory crumbled around him. The darkness was gone, the whispers silenced. The nightmare was over. But as he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. A part of the factory still lingered, waiting, watching. The moment of truth had passed, but the terror had only just begun. The factory groaned as it crumbled around Lucas, but the battle wasn't over. The air was thick with tension, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The shadows had pulled back, retreating to the corners, but their presence still lingered, a constant threat, just out of sight. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct telling him to run, to escape while he still could. But something held him in place. He wasn't finished. The factory wasn't finished with him. Through the haze of dust and debris, Lucas saw it. The entity, the dark, twisted figure that had been tormenting him, wasn't gone. It stood in the distance, its form flickering like a dying flame. But it was different now, weaker, smaller. It no longer loomed over him as it once had, but its presence still filled the room with a suffocating sense of dread. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, Lucas could see the rage boiling within them. The entity was angry, no, furious. He had defied it. He had fought back. And now, it was out for revenge. "You think you can escape?" The entity's voice was a guttural snarl, no longer the cold, emotionless whisper it had once been. It was desperate, furious. The shadows writhed around it, trying to reform, but Lucas could see the cracks. The entity's power was failing, but even in its weakened state, it was dangerous, deadly. Lucas took a step forward, his heart racing, but his resolve stronger than ever. He had faced his past. He had confronted his guilt, his fear, and survived. But the factory wasn't just a memory. It was a force, a malevolent presence that thrived on the darkness within him. And now, in its final moments, it was determined to drag him down with it. The entity lunged. It moved faster than Lucas had anticipated, a blur of shadow and rage, closing the distance between them in an instant. Its long, twisted arms reached out, the fingers sharp like claws, aiming straight for his chest. Lucas barely had time to react, throwing himself to the side as the entity's claws slashed through the air, missing him by inches. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his side, but he scrambled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The factory walls groaned, metal screeching, as the building began to collapse in on itself. The ground beneath Lucas's feet trembled, and he could feel the heat rising from deep within the earth, as if the very core of the factory was burning. But he couldn't focus on that. The entity was coming for him again, its hollow eyes blazing with fury, its grin widening into a grotesque snarl. It wasn't just attacking him. It was feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every drop of terror it could extract. Lucas knew he couldn't fight it head-on. The entity thrived on fear, on guilt, on the very emotions that had nearly destroyed him. If he gave in, even for a moment, it would consume him. But he had learned something during his time in the factory, something the entity didn't expect. The darkness didn't control him. He controlled it. The shadows moved with the entity, swirling around it like a storm. But Lucas stood his ground, his fists clenched, his breath steady. He wasn't that frightened child anymore. He wasn't the boy who had caused the accident, who had let the guilt fester inside him for years. He had made peace with his past, and the factory no longer had any power over him. The entity lunged again, its claws aimed at his throat, but this time Lucas didn't flinch. He stepped forward, straight into the heart of the shadows. The darkness wrapped around him, cold and suffocating, but he didn't falter. He could feel the entity's power closing in, the oppressive weight of its presence bearing down on him like a tidal wave. But in the center of that storm, Lucas found something unexpected, calm. "You don't control me," Lucas said, his voice steady, even as the shadows twisted around him. "You never did." The entity's eyes widened in shock, its form flickering, unstable. It hesitated, just for a second, but that was all Lucas needed. With a surge of determination, he reached out, plunging his hands into the darkness surrounding the entity. The cold hit him like a wall of ice, but he pushed through, his fingers grasping for something solid. And then, deep within the heart of the shadows, he found it, the source of the entity's power. It was small, fragile, like a dying ember, but it pulsed with a dark, malevolent energy. Lucas gripped it tightly, his hands shaking from the effort, and pulled. The entity let out a scream, a sound that wasn't human, a raw, animalistic shriek of rage and pain. The shadows around it exploded outward, the force knocking Lucas backward, but he held on. He could feel the entity's power slipping, draining away as he pulled the ember from its core. The factory trembled violently, the walls shaking, the ceiling crumbling. The entity writhed, its form collapsing in on itself, the shadows flickering and dying as its power drained away. "No," the entity hissed, its voice weak, broken. "You can't." But it was too late. With one final, desperate scream, the entity disintegrated, its form collapsing into a cloud of black smoke, the shadows evaporating into nothingness. The ember in Lucas's hand flickered once, twice, and then went out. The factory let out a deafening groan, the entire building shaking as if it were in its death throes. Lucas staggered to his feet, his body aching, but the adrenaline kept him moving. He had to get out. The walls were crumbling, the floor cracking beneath his feet. The factory was dying, taking everything with it. He ran, his legs burning with exhaustion, his lungs screaming for air. The sound of collapsing metal and crumbling stone echoed behind him, but he didn't look back. The door, the same one he had entered through, was just ahead. With one final burst of energy, he threw himself through it, just as the factory collapsed into a pile of rubble behind him. Lucas hit the ground hard, rolling onto his back, gasping for breath. The dust settled around him, the deafening sound of destruction fading into an eerie silence. For a long moment, he lay there, staring up at the night sky, his mind numb, his body aching. It was over. The factory was gone. The entity was gone. But as he lay there, his body shaking with exhaustion, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had defeated the entity, destroyed its source of power. But the darkness, the shadows, it had left something behind. Deep within him, a part of the factory still lingered, waiting. And as he closed his eyes, he heard it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The whisper, "We'll meet again." Lucas stood outside the ruins of the factory, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his heart still racing from the terror he had just escaped. The air was still thick with dust and the faint smell of burnt sugar, but the building behind him was nothing more than a heap of crumbling stone and twisted metal now. The oppressive weight that had hung over him throughout his ordeal seemed to have lifted, but not completely. Even in the silence, there was something wrong, something unfinished. He looked down at his hands, still trembling from the final confrontation with the entity. The cold touch of the shadows lingered on his skin, as if the darkness had left an invisible mark on him. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, of memories, of guilt. He had faced his past, defeated the entity that had fed on his fear, but it didn't feel like victory. The factory was gone, but the terror wasn't. It clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to calm the pounding in his chest, but the silence around him felt wrong. Too quiet, too empty. The factory had collapsed, the entity was defeated, but he couldn't escape the feeling that it wasn't truly over. Something was still watching him. Something was waiting. The night was unnaturally still. Not even the wind stirred. The faint echo of the factory's collapse seemed to hang in the air, reverberating through the ruins, but it wasn't the only sound. There was something else, something faint, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder the longer he stood there. A whisper, not the kind he had heard inside the factory, but something softer, more distant, like the wind carrying a voice from far away. Lucas. His blood ran cold. He spun around, his eyes scanning the ruins, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the rubble, the twisted remains of the factory lying silent and still under the moonlit sky. But the whisper persisted, growing louder, more insistent. It echoed in his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a vine, tightening with every passing second. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" The voice whispered, a cruel edge to its tone. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't coming from the ruins. It was coming from within him. He stumbled back, his breath quickening, his mind racing. How could this be happening? He had destroyed the entity, ripped out the heart of the factory's darkness, watched it collapse into dust. But now, standing in the open air, away from the shadows, he realized the horrifying truth. The factory wasn't just a place. It was part of him now. The entity, the darkness, had left a mark, buried deep within his soul, and it was still there, whispering, waiting. Suddenly, the cold night air seemed to close in around him, and Lucas felt the familiar weight of the shadows pressing against his skin. The whisper grew louder, the voice more distinct, as if it were standing right behind him, breathing down his neck. He turned, expecting to see the entity, its hollow eyes and twisted grin, but there was nothing. Just the ruins, bathed in eerie moonlight, and the echo of his own fear. But the whisper wouldn't stop. "We are not finished." The voice was calm, almost mocking now, as if the entity was amused by Lucas's struggle. "You can destroy the factory, Lucas, but you can't destroy me." The words sent a chill down his spine. The factory had been a vessel, a physical manifestation of the darkness, but the true evil, the entity, had found something far more permanent to cling to, him. His breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest. He backed away from the ruins, but it didn't matter how far he went. The voice followed him, like an echo in his mind. The farther he walked, the louder it became, until it was all he could hear, drowning out the world around him. Lucas collapsed to his knees, gripping his head, trying to silence the voice, but it was relentless. The entity had wormed its way into his thoughts, into his very being, and now it was part of him. The weight of the factory's darkness was still there, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on him from within. He could feel it, just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness to take control. "You thought you were free," The voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. "But you'll never be free, Lucas. You are mine now." Terror gripped him, stronger than anything he had felt inside the factory. This wasn't just fear of a place, of a malevolent force lurking in the shadows. This was something far worse. The entity had become part of him, entwined with his thoughts, feeding off his emotions, his guilt, his fear. He could run from the ruins, escape the physical remnants of the factory, but he could never escape himself. The darkness was in him now. Lucas's thoughts raced, trying to find a way out, but the voice was always there, cutting through his every attempt to think clearly. "You'll never escape. I'm in your mind, Lucas, in your soul, and I will never let you go." The factory had been a prison, but the entity had found a new one, a far more permanent one. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, the voice would always be there, whispering in the back of his mind, feeding on his fear. The realization hit him with the force of a hammer. There was no escaping it. The darkness had followed him out of the factory and was going to haunt him for the rest of his life. Lucas stood, his legs shaking beneath him, and stared at the ruins one last time. The factory was gone, but the evil it harbored was still very much alive. It had found a new home, hidden deep within his mind, where it could whisper to him, torment him, twist his thoughts until he no longer knew what was real and what was the entity's manipulation. He turned away from the ruins, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. He could leave this place, but he knew that wherever he went, the entity would be with him, always, waiting, whispering. As Lucas walked into the night, the voice echoed in his mind, soft but insistent. "We'll meet again, Lucas. We always do." And deep down, he knew it was right. The nightmare had only just begun.